Good evening. We begin tonight with an important story, details of which may sound very familiar to a lot of Americans given our history over the past few years in places like Iraq. Tonight, Pentagon sources are telling NBC News Syria is preparing chemical weapons for their possible use against the Syrian people in the form of aerial bombs. It's believed this specific intelligence is the reason why President Obama took a hard line against Syria just a few days ago, warning them there would be consequences if these weapons were used. Let's begin here tonight with the very latest on what we know, starting with our Pentagon correspondent, Jim Miklaszewski. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. U.S. officials tell us that the Syrian military is poised tonight to use chemical weapons against its own people. And all it would take is the final order from Syrian President Assad. As the fighting grows more intense and Syrian rebels close in on Damascus, the Syrian regime has turned increasingly desperate. U.S. officials tell NBC News the Syrian military has now loaded the precursor chemicals for sarin nerve gas into aerial bombs that could be dropped from dozens of Syrian fighter bombers. This week, U.S. intelligence detected a flurry of activity at chemical weapons sites, like this one, the Furcluse Weapons Depot near Homs. Today, while U.S. officials confirm the precursor chemicals are loaded, they must still be mixed together to create the deadly sarin gas. The alarming development shook the world. President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued strong warnings to Syria's President Assad that there would be serious consequences if he used chemical weapons.
It's the point of no return. They're going to lose any sort of backing that they had from the Chinese and Russians in terms of blocking the UN vote. And it's simply it's a suicide move.
The killing force of sarin nerve gas is devastating. Iraq's Saddam Hussein killed 5,000 Kurds with a sarin gas attack on Halabja in 1988. U.S. officials stressed tonight that as of now, these sarin weapons remain in the depots, have not been loaded onto any airplanes, and that President Assad has not given the order to use them. But officials here concede that if he does, there's very little the outside world can do to stop it. Brian.
Well, there you have it. Jim Miklaszewski starting us off from the Pentagon tonight. Jim, thanks. And of course, this news further complicates a chaotic part of the world, makes for another difficult situation for the U.S., among others. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, is in Washington tonight. Andrea, here we go again. American public not anxious to hear about any U.S. military involvement anywhere else on the planet, hearing terms like weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons. What is the U.S. to do?
I mean, you've got a real credibility gap that goes back now more than a decade, but the specific intelligence that Mick just reported, the movement of Syria's chemical stockpile, explains exactly why the president and Hillary Clinton warned Bashar al Assad so forcefully this week not to use those weapons, a warning that Secretary Clinton repeated at NATO again today.
Our concerns are that an increasingly desperate Assad regime might turn to chemical weapons, or might lose control of them to one of the many groups that are now operating within Syria.
Now, officials say they believe that those warnings did work so far. They are concerned, though, about the rising influence of extremist groups among the rebel fighters. So the State Department is preparing to designate one Syrian rebel group, the al-Nusra Front, as a terrorist organization because of its alleged close ties to al-Qaeda in Iraq. Still, next week, Secretary Clinton will announce that the U.S. is taking a big step, recognizing the main opposition Syrian rebel group as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people, even as the rebels tighten the noose around Assad. Brian?
Andrea Mitchell in our Washington bureau. Andrea, thanks. While we wish we had better news to report, with that in mind, we now go to Egypt, where the situation there, the violence, the president fleeing the palace, looks very familiar. Secretary Clinton today tried, again, urging Egyptians to settle their differences peacefully. Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, saw today's fighting firsthand. He's standing by for us in Cairo tonight. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Egyptian President Mohamad Morsi's supporters, the Muslim Brotherhood, want a strong president. They want more Islamic law. His opponents say the president is forcing an Islamic agenda down their throats. And today, the two sides clashed. On the doorstep of Egypt's presidential palace, running clashes tonight.
the fighting leaving hundreds injured.
The front line in this street battle is very fluid. Sometimes the anti-Morsi demonstrators, those who are right here, will make advances just a few yards and then get driven back. There are no police here. They've been pushed away. So now it is just the two sides facing each other in the streets.
As one side advances, the other retreats. Demonstrators kept police from the scene. They're still mistrusted here for attacking protesters during the revolution against Mubarak. There were cheers as the police withdrew.
When the Egyptian people go out again in the street, they never go back. They must win. Otherwise, the Muslim Brotherhood will destroy Egypt.
A battle for the soul of the biggest country in the Arab world.
And tonight, Brian, 4 of President Morsi's 22 advisors have resigned in protest, saying President Morsi should do more to bring calm here. Brian?
Richard Engel back tonight in a familiar hotspot in Cairo. Richard, thanks.